Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
Very well, Michael. Pleasure to be joining you on this lovely, balmy summer's evening.
We have some interesting stories coming up. 4 people have been arrested in connection with the direct action at RAF Brize Norton. In the second half of the show, I'll be speaking to cognitive scientist Gary Marcus about why LLMs might not be all they're cracked up to be. Now, I've said it before on the show, and we've talked about AI. I've had a few people emailing saying you're vastly overestimating the importance, the significance of large language models, the kind of things that power ChatGPT. Now, Gary Marcus is pretty much the world's most prominent critic of LLM. So don't say I don't listen to your emails. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. Stay tuned for all of that. If you'd like to support our work, as ever, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. In his third U-turn in a month, Keir Starmer has offered significant concessions to backbenchers in a bid to avoid a major rebellion over his welfare bill next week. The welfare bill was set to strip £5 billion from the welfare budget, mainly through limiting who could access disability personal independence payments, or PIPs. The backlash was huge. Over 120 MPs from across the party said this was unacceptable, and now Keir Starmer has largely caved in. So after 24 hours of negotiations with rebel backbenchers, Work and Pensions Secretary Liz Kendall sent a letter confirming 3 changes to Labour MPs. This is the text from her letter. She says, firstly, we recognise the proposed changes have been a source of uncertainty and anxiety. Therefore, we will ensure that all of those currently receiving PIP will stay within the current system. The new eligibility requirements will be implemented only from November 2026 for new claims only. And she goes on, secondly, we will adjust the pathway of universal credit payment rates to make sure all existing recipients of the UC health element and any new claimant meeting the severe conditions criteria have their incomes fully protected in real terms. Colleagues rightly want to ensure that disabled people and those with ill health are at the heart of our reforms. And she says, we will take forward a ministerial review of the PIP assessment led by the Minister for Social Security and Disability to ensure the benefit is fair and fit for the future. At the heart of this review will be co-production with disabled people, the organisations that represent them, and MPs, so their views and voices are heard. Meg Hillier, who tabled the reasoned amendment that could have killed the welfare bill and was satisfied with those changes, she told Sky this.
This is a good deal. It's a big change since last week. Massive changes to ensure that the most vulnerable people are protected in terms of their personal independence payments and the health element of universal credit, and crucially involving disabled people themselves in the design of future benefit changes under the TIMS review, under Stephen Twymms, the DWP minister. So that's a real breakthrough that's going to be long lasting. The government's been really listening to Labour MPs and is going to protect people who are currently in receipt of personal independence payments so that it won't decrease. And also people who receive the health element of universal credit, that will also be protected. So, in line with Labour values, it's about protecting the most vulnerable.
So according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the concessions will more than halve the amount of money the bill was supposed to save the Treasury. So the bill was supposed to save £5.5 billion. It will now only save £2.5 billion. So that's a lot of political capital spent and a lot of disabled people very distressed for ultimately not that much money. And even after the concessions, the welfare bill is still being opposed by disability groups. So MENCAP, the learning disability charity, released this statement. They say, we are encouraged that campaigners have been heard in their opposition to the planned cuts. But we fear that if, from next year, new claimants for PIP face different rules, there will be a generational divide in the quality of life for people with a learning disability. The Disability Benefits Consortium, which is a coalition of more than 100 disability charities, released their own statement saying this. These supposed concessions to the cuts bill are just a desperate attempt to rush through a disastrous piece of legislation. By pushing the cuts onto future claimants, the government are portraying the next generation of disabled people. Why should someone who needs support to wash in 2025 be entitled to PIP, but not someone who has the same needs in 2035? If the bill passes in its revised form, it will still push more people into poverty and worsen people's health. We urge MPs to use their power to stop this impending disaster. The bill must be stopped in its tracks. The Guardian also reports that at least 50 Labour MPs are still opposed to the welfare bill despite these concessions. They presumably include Diane Abbott, who tweeted this last night. Phony concessions will not fundamentally improve disability benefit cuts. Dropping it is the only way, or dropping the bill is the only way. Aaron, what do you make of this? I mean, Keir Starmer will have avoided, it seems, losing a vote next week. He seems to have won around enough MPs. I suppose two different angles here. Has this sort of seriously damaged his standing politically? And also, are these concessions enough in terms of protecting the rights of disabled people?
Well, they have damaged his standing. Very similar to the winter fuel allowance, of course. That was originally meant to bring in about 1.4, 1.5 billion changes to the winter fuel allowance for pensioners. Previously 12 million recipients, going down to 2 million. Now it looks like it'd be 10 million. So you've lost a hell of a lot of political capital. Ultimately, actually, in the case of winter fuel allowance, probably for a net loss of money. In this instance, you're still allegedly raising about 2.5 billion for the exchequer. So I suppose in that regard, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the cabinet or a special advisor to a senior member of cabinet, well, okay, we've lost lots of political capital, like the winter fuel allowance, but at least we're getting some money for it, albeit not very much. Two quick points, really, Michael. Firstly, 2.5 billion in the context of what the government is saying on things like defence spending is a pittance. We have a government now committed to spending 5% of GDP on defence by, I think, the middle of the next decade. 5% of GDP today, Michael, is 140 billion pounds. We presently spend 60 billion on defence spending. So 5% of GDP today would mean an additional 80 billion being allocated to defence budgets towards our armed forces. Now, Labour are trying to do some accountancy tricks. You know, they'll probably include various industrial policies and steel manufacturing supply chains to cover their backs there. But in any case, it's going to mean a lot of money. Most recently, of course, there was the announcement of this deal for 12 F-35s that will carry American-made thermonuclear weapons. That was approximately £1 billion, just 12 planes. So you're talking absolutely huge numbers when it comes to these commitments around NATO and defence spending. Like I say, 5% of GDP, not to be scoffed at. Over double what we presently spend on defence. And then ultimately trifling amounts by comparison raised through cuts to things like disability benefit, PIP, or in the case of older people, winter fuel allowance, which was then subsequently scrapped. There are a few things that you could change which probably would raise significant amounts of money. You could maybe get rid of the triple lock on pensions. That probably would raise 10, 15 billion pounds a year. But even then, in comparison to what's being talked about with defence spending, and there is 101 other things that the country needs to spend money on, but that's what Starmer is focusing on, defence spending, it's nowhere near enough. Then the second point, Michael, is this. Rachel Reeves has got her numbers so badly wrong with regards to projected growth, with regards to the costs of borrowing, et cetera, that I suspect the main problem for Labour isn't just that they've effectively broken their covenant with the voters on things like welfare. We'll be better than the Tories. Well, actually, no, you won't. Okay, we're losing a ton of political capital. We will be a bit better than the Tories then, fine. We'll renege on these things that we were going to do, winter fuel allowance and now this. The big problem for Labour, Michael, is I think they're going to have to keep going back. So there's this change now, which is going to bring in 2.5 billion. But I suspect in a year's time, because growth is undershooting, because the costs of borrowing are higher than expected, because there'll be more and more geopolitical shocks just by virtue of the historical moment in which we live, it'll have to happen again and again and again. And I think it's going to be political death by 1,000 cuts. So Labour aren't on top of the policy, they're not on top of the economics, and they're not on top of the messaging. That all means one thing, really. At the next general election, they are going to get one hell of a hiding.
I suppose that's it might also be if Keir Starmer isn't in power, the next leader might have the same problems. But I suppose there's a bigger chance for a change if he goes. And he doesn't seem like he's enjoying the job. So The Observer has published a profile today of the Prime Minister. It's by his biographer, Tom Baldwin. And Starmer sounds like he has a lot of regrets. So he says this. This is Tom Baldwin writing. He accepts his gloomy speech in the Downing Street garden last summer where he warned things will get worse before they get better was a mistake. It squeezed the hope out, he says. We were so determined to show how bad it was that we forgot people wanted something to look forward to as well. That's not the only speech Keir Starmer apparently regrets, because this is what he said about his speech where he warned that Britain was becoming an island of strangers. So Tom Baldwin writes, the left announced his speech as shameful and warned Starmer was dancing to the populist Reform UK's party tune. Starmer insists none of that is true. The speech was simply a mistake. I wouldn't have used those words if I had known they were, or even would be interpreted as an echo of Powell, he said. I had no idea, and my speechwriters didn't know either, he says. But that particular phrase, no, it wasn't right. I'll give you the honest truth. I deeply regret using it. And the piece goes on. The Prime Minister also accepts there were problems with the language in his foreword to the policy document that said the record high numbers of immigrants entering the UK under the last government had done incalculable damage to the country. Although Starmer says the issue needed addressing because the party became too distant from working class people on things like immigration, he accepts, quote, this wasn't the way to do it in this current environment. I mean, you can read the whole piece online. It's strange because it's a sympathetic piece because Tom Baldwin is sort of trying to show him as a sort of sensitive man. He's had some difficult events in his family over the past 12 months under pressure, including, with his old house getting firebombed. The story from Tom Baldwin is that this guy has struggled over the past year, but he's a real human. And I suppose it's trying to paint him as someone with integrity who's a real human. But I mean, what's striking is it's quite a long article, and there isn't a single moment where Keir Starmer says, I'm proud of that. I did that right. Or even, I want to do this. It's all just Keir Starmer saying, well, this is quite difficult, actually, and I basically regret everything I've done over the past 12 months. Aaron, reading it, my thought was, is this man okay?
It was a very strange article, Michael, a series of interviews, like I say, staggered over multiple places, multiple times. And I have to say, it read like one of those ghost-written autobiographies, like The Journey with Tony Blair. It felt like a meandering exit interview from the job. It didn't feel like something where the interviewee was a serving prime minister. Like you say, it was all retrospective, quite a lot of bitterness there, quite a lot of regrets. It's like, you're still the prime minister. You can still do stuff. Very, very, very surreal. And like you say, Tom Baldwin, ultimately, Michael, is very sympathetic to Keir Starmer. I would say borderline propagandist for Keir Starmer. Maybe not now, of course, because the political project has basically collapsed. He was the head of comms for the second vote, the people's vote, the Remain in Europe, Stop Brexit campaign. So he's politically sympathetic, and that's his faction of the Labour Party, the Labour right. So it was a very, very, very strange thing to read, and Keir Starmer is clearly now beginning to grasp he really, really screwed things up. But what's also strange, Michael, is there's not a clear diagnosis. Okay, so this went wrong, this went wrong, this went wrong. Why? Because if you know why, you can stop it from happening again. You're only 1 year into a potentially 5-year term. It's not like he's 4 years into a 5-year term. He's 1 year into a 5-year term. There might not be a general election for 4 years. Why did these things happen? You can stop them happening again. Finally, Michael, I regretted this thing being in the speech. If I knew, I never would have said it. This is an honest question to you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Michael, and also the people watching and listening. Does Keir Starmer, and maybe he doesn't, does he not read the speeches before he says them? It's got your name on it, pal. You really should. I don't expect a prime minister to write all their speeches. They probably should have some input, but they should certainly read them before the words emanate from their mouths, because, of course, you have extraordinary power, not just in terms of policy and political outcomes, but in terms of rhetoric and setting the national tone of conversation and setting the agenda. If you're not going to literally read the speeches you say, you're in the wrong job, because you're responsible for the consequences that flow out of them.
No, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, as far as I remember in the article, and I have to say, I don't find this a convincing article as to why this guy should be prime minister. But there was, I think his brother had passed away. He said he was clearing out his house, and then his house got fired. There's sort of a series of difficult sounding events in Keir Starmer's life, and he says, and the sort of the implication is that meant he didn't quite have time to read the speech. But if you're giving or read it properly or think about it properly, but if you're giving a speech on something as sensitive as immigration, this was supposed to be a big reset speech on immigration, you probably should read it. If you're so busy that you don't have time to read it, you should probably cancel the speech. You should probably put it off a day, because it's embarrassing, isn't it? If you're the prime minister to say, oh, yeah, I didn't really mean that. Sorry. I hadn't looked through the speech properly. if you're not reading your own speeches, you've got no plan for what's going to happen over the next 4 years. As I say, read the article. You can't find a single thing he says he's going to do. There's not a single thing he's proud of doing, not a single thing he's planning to do. And it all does seem like he might not be Prime Minister for very long. Aaron, do you think he might be out soon? I mean, everyone's talking about it now.
Who replaces him? Who replaces him? Rachel Reeves? There was that great poll today in Labour List, Michael. I think 46% of Labour members, not Labour voters, not the public, 46%, nearly half of Labour members want Rachel Reeves to quit. They don't want her to be the Chancellor. So who? Rachel Reeves? Andy Burnham isn't even a member of Parliament. He'd be one strong candidate. Wes Streeting has a majority of what, 500-600? I mean, really? So who? Angela Rayner is the most likely candidate. I think she'll lose her seat anyway. I think from the perspective of, okay, as the Labour Party, we might not be forming the next government. We could still be the second largest party, maybe even the largest party. I personally think that's implausible, but maybe the largest party. Who is going to defend the seats we have to the best of their ability and minimise losses? I mean, I think that's clearly Angela Rayner. That said, I think she's going to lose her seat as well. So it's a tough one. But, they should not be picking Starmer's replacement on the basis of this person can win the next election, because I think somehow, Michael, with their majority after 12 months, not even 12 months, they've screwed it up. So yeah, my two bobs worth would be Angela Rayner. But of course, the Labour right faction, which put Starmer in charge, does not like that idea one bit. And equally, is Angela Rayner really her own person? I think this is really critical, Michael. The left should be wise enough to not just back Angela Rayner if she gets in. Yep, she's our person. We can turn this around. The Labour Party is the site of contestation, blah, 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 blah. No. I think the direction of the Labour ship in government is set. Turning it around is like trying to turn around the Titanic. She might be able to gravitate 5 degrees this or that way. I don't think she's going to be able to do much beyond that. And I think the left, the wider left, would discredit itself quite significantly if it decided to go down with the sinking ship with Rear Admiral Rayner at the helm.
I suppose, what does that mean, though? Because, I mean, there are still people in the Labour Party who say it's... I mean, I don't encourage people to leave the Labour Party. I don't encourage people to join the Labour Party. I think sort of staying in the Labour Party and trying to strengthen the left is one imperfect strategy among many, let's say. Joining the Greens, starting a new party, staying in Labour to try and, if there's a shift in politics, to try and get someone selected as a Labour candidate for London Mayor who's the next Zoran Mamdani. I'm kind of sympathetic to all three of those options, however imperfect they all are. I mean, do you disagree?
No, I think that's right. I think that there are two big advantages to a potential Rayner leadership. One is I think that ultimately the left should focus on electoral reform. Not everybody is talking about it, but I think it's actually something we should care about. I think Britain's politics is completely dysfunctional until we get proportional representation. And then I think secondly is about candidate selection for Labour going into the next election, not just at Westminster, but also in local elections too. The undemocratic reselections done by party head office, by the unelected party bureaucracy, that has to end. The blocking of really strong candidates, people like Faiza Shaheen, etc., that has to end. So there are clearly real advantages to an Angela Rayner leadership, Michael. I don't doubt that for one second. And of course, some of the policies on things like workplace rights, public ownership of rail, etc., that will probably proceed in a better direction than it would under somebody like Wes Streeting. My point is, though, Michael, there is going to be a moment if Starmer is replaced, and I think Moretta's probably the favourite to do that. She might not, of course. Favourites in politics often don't win. Look at Michael Portillo after John Major. Look at Gordon Brown after Blair. Yes, he did succeed him, but it was terrible in 2010. Often it doesn't work out like that. Theresa May, anointed as the Merkel of Britain, she throws away a majority in the 2017 general election. So it doesn't always work out positively, but there will clearly be a moment if Starmer goes and Rayner comes in to take the leadership and becomes the first female Labour Prime Minister, where the left is going to be challenged. And I think it is a mistake to say we're going balls to the wall. This is our person, all in. We're behind you. Here's all our chips. I just don't think it's wise because it's not the left's program. It is not the left's program, Michael. Sending flights from an RAF base in Cyprus to go over Gaza every 10 minutes is not our program. Cutting, PIP is not our program. The agenda with regards to things like cuts to local government is not our program. It's literally insane. This is the last thing we should be doing as a country. So yeah, there's upsides, there's advantages. I certainly wouldn't criticise anybody for being in the Labour Party. My wife's a Labour councillor, and many people in the Labour Party do very good work. But you will have pressure from some people like Paul Mason or whatever. Now that Rayner is the Prime Minister, everybody in the left needs to join the Labour Party and back the Labour Party. No. I think it's precisely then that you need a smart strategy pursuing change through a range of avenues, including, like I say, independents and the Greens and whatnot.
For reference, I've just looked on Odds Checker. The favourite to be the next Labour leader is Wes Streeting. They're on 5-1. So, according to Odds Checker, it's quite open. 5-1, and then Angela Rayner is on 6-1. If I've read that correctly. Yeah, I have read that correctly. So no one looks like a dead cert if you believe the betting markets. If you heard the word Palestine in the news today, it was probably because of this.
A 29-year-old woman and two men, aged 36 and 24, have been arrested on suspicion of a terror offence. That's after two Voyager aircraft were damaged at RAF Brize Norton in an action that was then claimed by the campaign group Palestine Action. There are expectations that the government is going to officially declare them a proscribed terror group in the near future.
So while counter-terror police in the UK have been busy chasing down non-violent protesters trying to stop a genocide, this is the latest news from Gaza. So Haaretz has published an article confirming that IDF troops are being ordered to shoot unarmed civilians waiting for humanitarian aid. Since May the 27th, 549 people have been killed near aid centres and in areas where residents were waiting for UN food trucks. Now, many of those aid centres are run by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It was set up by Israel in coordination with US evangelicals and private security contractors. The GHF distribution centres only open 1 hour a day. So you've got very few of them serving 2 million people, all completely starving. And an IDF soldier told Haaretz how hungry civilians are dealt with if they turn up outside of the single hour that this fake aid organisation opens. So this is from an Israeli army soldier speaking to Haaretz. It's a killing field. Where I was stationed, between 1 and 5 people were killed every day. They're treated like a hostile force. No crowd control measures, no tear gas, just live fire with everything imaginable. Heavy machine guns, grenade launchers, and mortars. Then, once the centre opens, the shooting stops, and they know they can approach. Our form of communication is gunfire. We open fire early in the morning if someone tries to get in line from a few hundred metres away, and sometimes we just charge at them from close range. But there's no danger to the forces. I'm not aware of a single instance of return fire. There's no enemy, no weapons. So it's open 1 hour a day. If you come outside of that 1 hour, you will get machine gunned by Israeli troops. He also said the activity in his area of service is referred to as Operation Salted Fish. Now, that might not mean much to you, but apparently it's the name of the Israeli version of the children's game Red Light, Green Light. Now, if you've seen Squid Games, red light, green light is when you come forward when it's green, you stop when it's red. And in Squid Games, you get shot if you move when the light is red. And the Israeli army seem to be literally recreating this in real life to have a real life version of Squid Games, where if Palestinians move at the wrong time, they get shot with machine guns and grenade launchers. Haaretz reports that the Israeli army is satisfied, though, that GHF's operations have prevented a total collapse of international legitimacy for continuing the war, especially since the war with Iran began. So they think that this has taken off the pressure. There was growing pressure. You have to allow some aid into Gaza. What they've done is they've let this fake aid organisation bring some aid in, and you might get shot while you're queuing up for it. And they think that that has appeased world opinion enough. And I mean, if you look at the statements from our government, I mean, it has, hasn't it? They're not talking about the need to get aid in anymore. An Israeli reservist told Haaretz this: Gaza doesn't interest anyone anymore. It's become a place with its own set of rules. The loss of human life means nothing. It's not even an unfortunate incident like they used to say. So that would be the IDF or the Israeli government saying, oh, it was an unfortunate incident when these civilians got killed. He says now they're just, oh, these civilians got killed. That's what's supposed to happen. Haaretz are also clear that orders to fire on civilians are coming from the top. So they say, in one incident, the soldier was instructed to fire a shell toward a crowd gathered near the coastline. And then this is a quote, technically, it's supposed to be warning fire, either to push people back or stop them from advancing, he said. This is a soldier. But lately, firing shells has just become standard practice. Every time we fire, there are casualties and deaths. And when someone asks why a shell is necessary, there's never a good answer. Sometimes merely asking the question annoys the commanders. In that case, some people began to flee after the shell was fired, and according to the soldier, other forces subsequently opened fire on them. If it's meant to be a warning shot and we see them running back to Gaza, why shoot at them, he asked. Sometimes we're told they're still hiding and we need to fire in their direction because they haven't left. But it's obvious they can't leave if the moment they get up and run, we open fire. So this is literally them chasing civilians around Gaza, desperately looking for food. And to tell them to go away, they shoot at them. And then if they hide from the gunfire, they shoot at them because they're hiding. And then if they try and run away, they shoot them because they're running. Now, this is very clearly a description of a genocidal war. And Haaretz has also published an article today about the true scale of death caused by Israel since October 2023. So they cite a new study by Prof. Michael Spagat, a world-class expert on mortality in violent conflicts. And his study suggests 100,000 Palestinians in Gaza have so far been killed. And this is from the Haaretz report. These data, says Prof. Spagat, position the war in the Gaza Strip as one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 21st century. Even if the overall number of war victims in Syria, Ukraine, and Sudan is higher in each case, Gaza is apparently in first place in terms of the ratio of competence to non-competence killed, as well as in terms of rate of death relative to population size. So in the 21st century, this is the highest proportion of a people who've been killed and the highest proportion of civilians to competence. Now, they say, according to the survey's data, which is consistent with those of the Palestinian Health Ministry, 56% of those killed have been either children up to the age of 18 or women. That's an exceptional figure when compared with almost every other conflict since World War II. Aaron, anyone who commits criminal damage in this country to protest this is now a terrorist.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, Michael. We talked about this extensively on Tuesday's show. I think there's a very robust centre-right defence of not prescribing Palestine action. We already have a ton of law on the statutes with regards to people committing acts of criminal damage or vandalism or political violence. And that can be addressed through the present system. Whatever your thoughts on Palestine action, and I think what this really is totemic of is the British state. Rather than enforce laws fairly, it tries to make political examples of people. It tries to clamp down on free speech, hence the prescription side of things. And of course, we've had political sentencing. Last summer, we saw racist rioting across the UK, significant amounts of violence, violent disorder, criminal damage. Much of that was outrageous. It was disgusting, actually. But it was notable that you had people being subject to very punitive sentencing for posts on social media, which I don't agree with. They were, illegal. But I don't think they were treated fairly in terms of sentencing. Nobody would say that what happened last summer, however, was terrorism. And in a democracy, there needs to be a space for protest, non-violent protest, criminal damage, etc. Even if it's on the very high end and very serious stuff, it's very important that is not treated as terrorism, because terrorism is effectively viewed as beyond the pale, and you remove basic human rights that you would confer upon people. I mean, that was the whole project with the war on terror, right? People ended up in Guantanamo Bay for 10, 15 years without even facing a charge because they were terrorists. Therefore, they weren't being treated as equal under the law. It's a very dangerous place to be. And ironically, Michael, you had the Home Secretary talking in Parliament recently dressed in the colours of the suffragettes. The suffragettes, of course, famously blew up a house belonging to David Lloyd George, a very famous Welsh politician in this country, one time Prime Minister at the start of the 20th century. So you have the same Home Secretary looking to criminalize dissent, even if it's quite serious protest tactics at play, in a manner which is entirely incongruous with her historical reference points. She would have presumably also have said in the early 20th century that the suffragettes were terrorists, and yet she's celebrating them in 2025. And I do also think, Michael, context is really important. There'll be many people watching or listening to this, and they'll say, well, I just simply do not agree it is ever permissible for UK nationals or people in this country to vandalize, even if it's just minor criminal damage, to vandalize key bits of national infrastructure like our armed forces. There will be people that say that. And I think, and that's a jumping off point. You can have that conversation. But I would then say in response, Michael, going to the story about people just being shot at with effectively Gatling guns by the IDF trying to get food, going to the fact that we're now seeing a growing body of evidence about deformities amongst newborn children, children dying en masse in ICUs because of electricity blackouts, pregnant women being shot, people being steamrolled by heavy artillery, by the IDF, etc., etc., etc. Surely, even if you think that, you look at all those images, you hear those numbers, 16,000 at least children in Gaza being killed, you can understand why somebody would be so angry and move to do what they did. My view on the prescription, Michael, is this. The reason why Yvette Cooper has done or why she's doing what she's doing, I think is quite simple. I suspect if these cases, and you got more of them over time, if these cases started to go to court, I think juries would be sympathetic. And I suspect that judges would not be giving the kind of sentencing that the government would require. So what you have effectively is a nominally, it is a democratic government. It's a nominally democratic government effectively trying to bypass the criminal justice system of this country. I find it extraordinary. And finally, on the prescription system, is it really fair? Is it sensible to have a system with regards to prescription where we at Novara Media, I could not wear a Palestine Action logo without facing criminal prosecution as a result, okay? Let alone defend what they do. I can't wear a T-shirt, right? Is it a sensible system where a single person, the Home Secretary, arbitrarily gets to determine what kind of individuals and what kinds of organizations meet that threshold? I don't think so. Because today it's Palestine Action they're the same as ISIS and the Taliban. Who is it tomorrow? And I think it goes to a broader question we're all facing right now. We're hearing all the time about threats now to the UK homeland. We're going to have, tests with regards to emergency alarms on our phones. This story that came out today. The UK needs to be ready for a full mobilization of war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are being primed as the British public, not necessarily for war, but for a return to a wartime economy of sorts. If you're going to spend 5% of GDP on defense, if you're going to more than double defense spending whilst cutting things like disability benefit, people can't get on the housing ladder, a nurse has 50 grand's worth of debt, people see potholes everywhere they live in their local authority, childcare is too expensive, so you can't have that second or third kid, your grandparents are struggling, you can't find good work. If all of that is happening and the government chooses to more than double defense spending, they need to create an environment in which that is at least somewhat seen to be legitimate. How do they do that? They have to scare the hell out of people, right? They have to scare the hell out of people. And so I think this prescription is just one part of that. And I think it's taking this country down a very, very dark route in terms of trying to stop and impede free democratic debate and to also shape the broader parameters of the political conversation. If you do not support more than doubling defense spending or spending £1 billion on 12 F-35s, then you're not patriotic. If you have really strong misgivings about 16,000 dead kids in Gaza, you're an anti-Semite or a terrorist or you're violent. I reject all of that. I would say to anybody that is not a big fan of Palestine Action, they've been moved to do what they've done because of the awful scenes in Gaza, historic scenes in Gaza. It is a genocide. It is ethnic cleansing. In the words of a former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, these are war crimes. And I think free citizens in this country, and we are free citizens, we're allowed to think freely for ourselves, need to ask why the government is criminalizing an organization like this while it supports an administration, Netanyahu's, guilty of some of the most revolting crimes of any advanced economy this century.
That, I suppose, law or the prescription of Palestine action will be going through Parliament next week, so we'll be discussing that much more then, I am sure. I've become fascinated and somewhat terrified by the risks of AI and talked about it at length on recent shows. Now, those risks that we've discussed have included job losses and misinformation, but also concerns that sound more like sci-fi, including AIs taking control. Now, one pushback I've got from you guys, sort of in the comments and by email, is to say that I've radically overestimated the power of the kind of large language models that power applications like Claude and ChatGPT. And one name more than any other has come up as a skeptic I should read: Gary Marcus. Now, Gary Marcus is Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neuroscience at New York University. In 2014, he founded Geometric Intelligence, a machine learning company later acquired by Uber. And he came to international prominence and when he was called to give evidence on artificial intelligence to the US Senate in 2023, alongside his co-witness Sam Altman. Now, in that hearing, Gary Marcus highlighted many of the dangers of AI and the need for regulation. But what he's most famous for, perhaps, in AI debates is his skepticism about the potential progress of large language models. As early as 2022, Gary Marcus was arguing that deep learning, which is the method for training LLMs, was hitting a wall. And his very popular and influential Substack contains plenty of articles explaining why he thinks many of the claims made about AI are all hype. He's even become a verb when Apple released an influential paper last month claiming to show that LLMs only provide the illusion of thinking. The venture capitalist Josh Wolf said, Apple just Gary Marcus'd LLM reasoning ability. Last year, Gary Marcus published the book, Taming Silicon Valley, How We Can Ensure That AI Works for Us. And I'm delighted to say he joins me now live. Gary, thank you so much for joining us. I suppose, can you start by explaining your position in the AI debate and the arguments that have made you so prominent in this space?
Well, I guess my position is that AGI is possible, that AI could be a good thing, but also that LLMs themselves are wildly overrated, are not going to bring us to AGI, have serious problems in reasoning and comprehension, and that we need to have some fundamental innovation.
What do you prefer? So you think that AGI, so artificial general intelligence, sort of this idea where AI becomes sort of more intelligent than us in various spheres or potentially all spheres, you think that's plausible, but it's not going to be via the LLM route. What do you think would be needed? What's your alternative?
So I think what we're most fundamentally missing are the tools of symbolic AI, of classical AI, where you write things in code, you have databases and what we call knowledge graphs and so forth. In large language models, they're a second-class citizen. People are increasingly trying to farm things out to symbolic tools like calculators and so forth, but LLMs themselves are not very good at reasoning over abstract knowledge. So what we need is what I've long called neurosymbolic AI. We're starting to see some movement towards that, but pure LLMs are not going to cut it.
And I suppose where I stand here is I don't have your expertise. I don't have the expertise of Geoffrey Hinton. I find it very difficult on an intellectual level to say whether or not I think LLMs could bring us AGI or whether it needs to be a different form. I suppose one thing sort of I look at, I use my ChatGPT, and I know something that's sometimes put to you is that you've sort of said that a current AI system or a current LLM is unable to do something and then potentially it gets overtaken by events. And obviously you're not alone in this. So I want to show a quote from Yann LeCun. So he's the chief AI scientist at Meta. He's one of the three godfathers of AI. And he said in 2022, I take an object, I put it on the table, and I push the table. It's completely obvious to you that the object will be pushed with the table. There's no text in the world, I believe, that explains this. If you train a machine as powerful as could be your GPT 5000, it's never going to learn about this. Now, anyone at home can put that scenario into the free version of ChatGPT now, and it can perfectly answer that question. And I just want to go to one example of you as well. Now, obviously, I'm not. This isn't a gotcha because I'm not in a position to really debate AI with you, but it's to sort of try and draw out the argument being made. So this is from an article you wrote in 2020. You were sort of calling out the ability of GPT for doing physical reasoning. So you said you're having a small dinner party. You want to serve dinner in the living room. The dining room table is wider than the doorway. So to get it into the living room, you will have to remove the door. You have a table saw, so you can cut the door in half and remove the top half. So that's obviously AI getting it completely wrong. You explain why it's got it completely wrong. So you say, this is one confusion after another. The natural solutions here would either be to tip the table on its side, often sufficient depending on the specifics of the geometry, or to take the legs off the table if they are detachable. I won't read all of this. Actually, you're sort of saying how ridiculous that answer is, and you're absolutely right. But then if you put that into the latest version of ChatGPT, so I put that in, sort of that scenario, and it gives you just the perfect answer. To get the dining room table into the living room, you will have to rotate or tilt it to fit it through the doorway at an angle, likely turning it on its side or diagonally. Then it gives you a perfect step-by-step, which suggests, from reading it, that it kind of understands spatial reasoning. It understands how to get the table through the door when it definitely didn't 4 years ago. And I suppose, how do you, if someone's looking and they're saying, well, the people who've critiqued LLMs as being able to sort of make serious advancement, if their predictions keep getting overtaken by the next model, how seriously should we take them? And I suppose, how do you respond to that? I know this is not an original question I'm putting to you, but I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I've been asked that question many times. And what you're missing is the context that any specific example that someone prominent, such as myself, writes about gets trained on, as far as we can tell, by OpenAI. So I'm sure that whole paper has been trained on. They've probably paid people, maybe from Scale AI or who knows, to do variations on that problem. But what we see, Ethan Mollick calls it the jagged frontier. I used to call it the pointillistic nature of these models, is they'll get specific examples, but you never know which examples they're going to get right and which they're going to get wrong. So if you go back to that 2020 paper, we talked about a core set of problems: physical reasoning, causal reasoning, and so forth. And there are still many problems that those systems have trouble with. It's just not those specific problems, because the systems have been trained on essentially every text that's out there, including things that I have written before and so forth. And I don't know if there's a compression problem. And so these systems get trained on these new examples, on the older examples, but people still find new examples all the time. There's a paper just published called something like Potemkin reasoning problems, showing lots of inconsistencies in how these systems reason up to O3 mini and so forth. So you see the same kinds of problems. So you don't see the specific problems, because the specific problems are trained on by the large language model manufacturers to some extent. They are never candid or transparent about what training they're actually doing. So from the outside, we can never know how much the model is actually improved, as opposed to how much it's trained on the specific examples. But we always see a kind of fragility where they'll get something right and then they'll get a variation wrong. So here's an example. They were trained on a lot of these river crossing problems. So a man and a goat have to get across the river. There's a boat, and there's some cabbage. The goat can't eat the cabbage, etc. And so the systems will now answer problems like that because they're in the training set. But then you change them slightly. So now you have a man and a woman in a boat. Now this one's been done and it'll also be trained on. But when somebody tried this a few months ago, a man and a woman are in a boat and need to get across the river, the system missed the obvious solution. If you put the man and the woman and you go across the river, and instead said, well, the man goes across the river, leaves the boat there, swims across to the other side, I forget what he does next, and then blah, blah, blah. It takes like 17 steps. And my daughter, I think she was 11 at the time, said, why don't you just put the man and the woman in the boat and cross to the other side? And so these systems will often get the things they were trained on, which now often I think includes particular examples that I've written about, but they don't generalize well.
People are saying now, because I mean, even if the current ChatGPT, you can put in sort of the old version and the new version. And I've put in a bunch of questions where the old version gets it wrong, the new version gets it right. And I don't think that can just be because of training, because presumably they're trained the same, but if you get it from the reasoning model, it does quite well. And I know that it's sort of said that they're quite good at frontier maths now, so really hard maths problems that a PhD student would struggle with. And there were mathematicians that put in a bunch of these that it couldn't possibly be trained on, and some of the new reasoning models did quite well. But you're still skeptical.
I'm still skeptical. For example, someone just did the USA Math Olympiads 6 hours after the problems were released, and performance was at 5%, right? So on some set of tests where there was advanced knowledge, clearly they were doing what we call data augmentation. They were building problems that were similar to the problems in the test set, and the systems did well. So somebody tried to control for what we call data contamination. And when there was only 6 hours, so they couldn't do that, the systems were at 5%. This is published, I guess, about a month ago. So you always have to worry. This is kind of my first answer, my previous answer. You always have to worry about data contamination. You always have to worry about the extent to which they can actually generalize if they haven't seen those problems, or at least very similar problems in the training set. And because the manufacturers, the developers, won't release what they've trained on, you don't know. The other thing we're finding is they do better on math problems where you can create augmented data, which is to say synthetic data rather than naturally observed data. You can do that pretty well in math because you know what the answers are. You can use basically classical symbolic systems to calculate the answer, and then you do the training. That works better than in other domains. So they're getting best performance in math where they can do this kind of workaround, but they're not finding that it works across the board.
Let's look at, I'm sure you've seen this clip many times as well, Gary Marcus. So I want to show a clip of you in that Senate hearing from 2023. And you kind of break protocol and put a question to Sam Altman instead of just answering questions from the Congress people.
When we get to AGI, artificial general intelligence, maybe let's say it's 50 years, that really is going to have, I think, profound effects on labor. And there's just no way around that. And last, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I will note that Sam's worst fear, I do not think is employment, and he never told us what his worst fear actually is, and I think it's germane to find out.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Mr. Altman if he cares to respond.
Yeah. Look, we have tried to be very clear about the magnitude of the risks here. I think jobs and employment and what we're all going to do with our time really matters. I agree that when we get to very powerful systems, the landscape will change. I think I'm just more optimistic that we are incredibly creative and we find new things to do with better tools, and that will keep happening. My worst fears are that we, the field, the technology, the industry, cause significant harm to the world. I think that could happen in a lot of different ways. It's why we started the company. It's a big part of why I'm here today and why we've been here in the past and we've been able to spend some time with you. I think if this technology goes wrong, it can go quite wrong. And we want to be vocal about that. We want to work with the government to prevent that from happening. But we try to be very clear-eyed about what the downside case is and the work that we have to do to mitigate that.
So Sam Altman to the Senate saying he started OpenAI because he was just so worried about AI risk. Did you believe him then, and do you believe him now?
I did believe him then, and I don't believe him now. I think that he told the Senate what it wanted to hear. I mean, on that particular point, I don't think he wanted to tell the Senate anything. And it's because I asked the question and asked Senator Blumenthal to re-asked the question that he even answered the question at all about his worst fear, which was significant harm to humanity. But I think in general, he was not a candid speaker at the Senate. He told the Senate, for example, that he supported licensing for art or some kind of payment for artists and writers, and he doesn't anymore. He told the Senate that he supports regulation for AI, and he doesn't really anymore. And the last time he was at the Senate, which was not then 2 years ago, but just a few weeks ago, he basically implied his worst fear was like China would get ahead of us or something like that. And he didn't really acknowledge then the significant harm. So, some of what he said in the Senate was true and some of it was partial truths.
Tell us what you're really concerned about when it comes to AI, because I know that you're sort of AI 2027, the report which we've talked about on this show before, where there's sort of total global catastrophe and AI could kill us all by the year 2030. You're sort of skeptical of, but you are still very concerned about AI. You've written a book about it. What are your big fears?
Well, I think there's two sets of fears. One is about what happens with LLMs, which are already causing a lot of harm. There was a piece by Kashmir Hill in the New York Times about how they're causing people who didn't have psychiatric histories to have delusions. They're obviously being used in misinformation. They're going to be used, or they are being used in cybercrime. They may lead to major cybercrime incidents. There are a lot of immediate pressing risks from these systems. They're discriminating in employment, et cetera. We're using these systems. They're not actually that smart. And putting a not smart system in charge of things is not itself a smart thing to do. So I'm pretty worried about that. I think there's a lot of that. We're seeing more and more of it every single day of these kind of inappropriate uses of these tools. In the long term, if systems do get smarter, we have to worry about how we're going to make them align with human values. LLMs are not well aligned with human values, and we need to make sure that the next generation of AI is better aligned.
Should we pause AI?
I wouldn't, but I would change the emphasis. So I think it's sort of a black and white question, the way you framed it. I think that AI has value. Large language models may actually be net cost to society, but AI in principle could have a benefit. And I think it's worth finding those benefits. But I think we need to work a lot more on AI safety and a lot more on alternative approaches that might be more reliable, more tractable. So I wouldn't pause AI, but I would put a lot less into LLMs and a lot more into alternatives that might be safer.
I suppose in terms of how someone like me, who's not an expert in AI, but reads quite a lot about, listens to podcasts, how I should sort of approach this issue. Because I suppose the way I look at it, you've got some experts who are much smarter than me saying LLMs could take us to AGI, and you should be concerned about existential risks to humanity. And people like Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, in that position. And they don't work for the tech companies. Geoffrey Hinton left Google to retire. He won the Nobel Prize. Yoshua Bengio, I think the most cited computer scientist in the world. He stayed in academia. Then you've got, they're saying the existential thing could happen. AGI could happen via LLMs. Then on the other side, you've got Jan LeCun saying there's nothing to worry about. This is all completely overblown. And then I suppose someone like you who's saying there are things to worry about, but these potentially sci-fi scenarios, they're probably all hype. I mean, is it not sensible for someone like me to think, well, all of those could plausibly be right, so I do need to prepare for existential catastrophe as well as the sort of misinformation or sort of manipulation that you talk about?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that nobody knows for sure. I would start there. I would second say that artificial intelligence is a pretty complicated field, and that making proper predictions depends on understanding the technical side of AI. And then most of the public conversations don't really go into the technical side, and I think are fairly naive from a perspective of cognitive science, of what thinking and intelligence actually is. And if you really want to understand, you have to learn a lot of stuff. It's not trivial to be able to follow these issues. I would say that LeCun is dismissive of risk, doesn't really have arguments for that other than, well, we've kind of muddled through before. But like, you could look at nuclear weapons, we've muddled through, but we've been, on the verge of catastrophe too. And so nuclear weapons are not the unalloyed good thing that he might sort of be implicitly committed to supporting. So I think that LeCun is naive about how bad things could get. I think that Bengio and LeCun are right that things could get serious. I don't share the notion of extinction itself being likely, because humans are very resourceful, and that way I agree a little bit with LeCun. And we're genetically diverse, we're geographically spread out, and then at least for the foreseeable future, the systems aren't that smart. And so I don't really see a scenario where an AI literally extinguishes the entire species. But I do think we should be worried about various kinds of catastrophes. So, for example, misinformation powered by deep fakes and LLMs and so forth could lead to an accidental nuclear war that's triggered over a misunderstanding about what actually happened. So that's very serious risk, even if it isn't literally extinction.
Where do you see the trajectory of this politically? Do you think that we will get regulation in time that can stop us accidentally going into a nuclear war?
No, I mean, I don't know let me be clear about that. I don't know the probabilities in any given moment of nuclear war, but I mean, already, like, misinformation could shape the US's entanglement with Iran, and it could tip that into a nuclear war. That's right now, right? I mean, that could happen. I won't say it will happen. There's many, many factors, but it's not out of the question that it could happen right now. And it's not out of the question that some other conflagration could erupt into a nuclear war right now, given the technology that we have. A lot of it is really a matter of deployment. You ask about regulation, at least in the United States, regulation is derailed. There's not really a lot of regulation. To the contrary, there's a provision in the Senate bill that's currently being considered that would forbid even states from making any regulation. The federal government isn't making any regulation. So if you're asking, are we vulnerable right now? The answer is yes. Do I think that we need regulation? Absolutely. Are we going to get it soon? Well, that's an issue by issue thing. We did get it for deepfake porn. We haven't gotten it for anything else. And one of the most dire needs is probably around misinformation. And nobody has the appetite right now in the United States to do anything about that.
Gary Marcus, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for your time. I know you're in high demand.
Thanks for having me.
Aaron Bastani, I want to bring you in on this. Is Downstream this week? Is it the Karen Howe interview?
I believe so, Michael. Yeah.
And what can people look forward to in that?
Well, Karen Howe doesn't have necessarily a criticism of LLMs in the same way that Gary Marcus does. Her critique is more about the actually existing AI industry, and specifically OpenAI. Sam Altman. Of course, Gary just touched on that a little bit about how he's changed his mind on the motivations of Sam Altman, but also Meta. These are two companies now which are at the forefront, alongside Google, of course, at the forefront of researching AI. And Karen's book looks at the whole supply chain of AI, where the data is coming from in terms of it being scraped, in terms of intellectual property rights violations, theft, fundamentally, in terms of some of the people that are filtering it for us to use as consumers on the final end of it. So people doing some of the safeguarding and whatnot, often in global South countries. Also human feedback to improve the quality of the outputs. A lot of that was happening in Venezuela, East Asia, various African countries like Kenya. So she's really, really good on actually existing AI, Silicon Valley, big tech. And her conclusion, Michael, is really startling. She says if the last 20 years, in terms of the lack of regulation on big tech, are repeated over the next 20 years with regards to artificial intelligence, even if we don't get AGI, which is a really legitimate question. I know you're obsessed with it right now, Michael. Even if we don't get AGI, she doesn't think democracy survives.
Wow. Do you have an answer to that? Because the democracy, I know in Jonathan Haidt, in his interview with you, he was saying that he was going to write a book about how democracy survives social media, and he couldn't find an answer. So he ended up writing a book about how it's destroying the mental health of children, which he thought there was an answer to. Do you think that democracy is over in the next 20 years because we're all living in different social media worlds?
I don't think this is new. I think that we've been moving towards a post-literate society for a very long time. Obviously, the television is a big part of that. I think that a free democratic society relies on free thinking, high information citizens capable of discerning right from wrong, facts from untruth. I don't think that the internet changes all of that. I think for many citizens, the internet actually, allows people to have higher and better quality information. I hope people watching Novara Media think that when they watch, your shows and my shows every night at 6 p.m, Michael. But I think in the round, particularly with generative AI, I think it's something really new. So this is a longer trend of post-literate culture, and I think that has clearly undermined the quality of democratic debate. But I think generative AI is something quite significant, and I kind of do think that democracy may be over for a bunch of reasons. I mean, that is one of them, and of course the other is that liberal democracies in much of the world aren't really producing the goods for their people. We talk about consent with, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party, and there is, according to all the data, a lot of consent, a lot of satisfaction amongst Chinese people with regards to their government. The reason being, over the last 25 years in particular, before that too, it's delivered the goods for working and middle class Chinese people. That's not been the case for the liberal democracies, particularly of Europe. You could say the US too, much of the US, but I think Europe really is on the front line of that stuff. So I think I think European democracy is most certainly imperiled. I think you can join that, the low growth rates, the lack of perceived legitimacy with elites. I think you add the generative AI, Michael. I think it's in a spot of bother.
All right, let's wrap up there. Big questions to ponder. Thank you, Aaron, for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael. Hope everybody watching and listening has a fabulous weekend.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.